We had a question on our Instagram about LSAs. And the question we asked was pretty straightforward. What questions do you have? And one question that we had asked essentially, are they here to stay? And the answer, I think, is in short, yes, but I want to elaborate a little bit on why I think that's the case. With Google, of course, none of us who are asked questions on a regular basis about what's Google going to do next, none of us have crystal balls. We're all, to an extent, just reading the tea leaves, as I like to say. But having said that, past behavior is the best indicator of future behavior. So I wanted to point out something that Google's doing that I think gives us a clue, or at least some indicator as to what's likely to happen with regard to local service ads. So are LSA here to stay? Let me show you what's going on in the search results, and then perhaps we can deduct something from that. If you notice in the search results, one of the things Google's been trending towards is something called a zero-click result. So what does that look like in practice? Here's a search that I did from Lafayette, Louisiana. And the question that I typed in was what to do after a car accident. And I want you to notice a couple of things about these results. Right here, what you see is Google answering the question, and you'll notice that where they're answering it from is from super lawyers, but they're making it so that you really don't even have to click in order to get the answer. Another example of that is the people also ask. I think that what you're seeing here is a trend towards Google ultimately looking to go end to end as it pertains to serving the end user, which is not you and I. It's the person searching, right? That's who they regard highest when they're thinking in terms of who are we serving. They care most about the searchers. And so when you look at zero clicks, this is a clue. They are trying to, number one, keep you inside of a Google ecosystem. And number two, they're trying to serve up the result, right? They want to connect you with the answer or the thing that you're looking for. I think local service ads is another example of this, where local service ads is sort of an appendage to Google Business Profile, Google Places, the local map pack results, as they're often referred to. That's another example of kind of a zero click result, because when you do a local search for any kind of service based industry, you can see the phone number. And although a lot of people do click on those results, they're not required to. They can just dial the phone number if that's what they feel like is the best way to get the result they're looking for. And local service ads, since it's a lead based product, is an example of Google connecting end to end. In this case, two different parties, because they're connecting the searcher with a service provider, but they're also connecting the service provider with a lead, which is a fairly big departure from what they have historically been, which was an advertiser who is paid based on the click. And so, yeah, I think that not only are they here to stay, but you're likely to see even more of these types of innovations in the future, where Google is providing some kind of an end to end transaction. I would bet on that being the case. And where I would look for a lot of changes in the next year is with respect to the Google Mum update. If I was speculating, I would say that the search results are probably going to be shaken up in terms of the landscape and how they look, where the way that they're oriented, being perhaps more visual in nature, because they're trying to make it easier for you to connect with the end result that you're looking for. And I also think with the advent of Performance Max and other AI driven ad products from Google, I think that it's highly likely that you may see other innovations that kind of fit within the same theme as local service ads. So end-to-end delivery from Google is here to stay and probably going to expand.
I'm Savannah, and this is Dave. We're here from the Local Services Ads Department at Clixsy.
And I'm Corey Vandenberg, and today we're going to talk to you a little bit about the top 5 tips that we have for local service ads.
All right, so I guess starting off, LSA has been active in earnest for 2 years now. What has the experience generally been for local business owners?
I would say for most local business owners, the experience has been positive using local service ads. However, there is one caveat to that. I'm hearing from a lot of local business owners that their performance is very up and down. Sometimes it's great, and other times it's not, and they don't know why. And I think that's been frustrating for a lot of business owners to really not understand, one, the criteria that Google's using to determine whether they get leads or not, and two, not really even understanding what the penalties are that might be associated with whatever that criteria is.
All right, so you talked about how clients don't really understand what they're being judged on. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. The local service ads platform operates on a few fundamental concepts. Namely, you're going to be judged based on, one, what is your proximity to the searcher? Google's going to be evaluating you based on whether or not you are, how close you are to them when at the time that they perform the search. The next criteria that they're going to look at is what we call review velocity. Internally, that's how we refer to it. And all that really means is how good are the reviews you're getting and how many of them are you getting in a period of time. So say, for example, are you getting 2 good reviews every week? Or are you getting, say, 10 good reviews a month? And that is going to be part of the equation to determine whether you get leads. The third criteria that they're going to look at is what's called responsiveness. And this is something that Google has, that's a name that they've used, but they haven't really well defined it. And so we're going to delve in a little bit later into what responsiveness might actually mean based on some of the evidence and observations that we've.
Yes, so it sounds like we've got 3. We've got proximity, proximity, reviews, and responsiveness. What would you say the best practices are for proximity?
Proximity, I think we have a few different clues that we've been given by Google. When we look at the main Google product that a local service ads account is attached to, it's the Google My Business listing, or the Google Business Profile, as it's known today. And so I think to an extent, you can take a lot of the best practices from Google Business Profiles and work backwards or extrapolate from it, maybe what the local service ads listing is also going to respond to. And what we typically see is that it's somewhat dependent on the niche. Say, for example, if you're talking about like a plumber or an electrician, I think it's highly unlikely that somebody outside of a radius of, say, maybe 30 miles is really going to be all that interested in responding to your listing. So that generally is a guideline that we'll use, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30, 50 miles max. On the other hand, there might be other niches like, say, injury lawyers or other types of law where maybe the client isn't going to be coming into your office all that frequently, if at all. And so the guidance that we've received from Google, and this might seem a little bit of absurd when you hear it, but they've told us to try and keep the radius that we're targeting under 300 miles away from your listing. I think it's probably unlikely that you're going to get very many clients at even 200 miles away from your listing, no matter what niche you're in. So while I think it's useful to know that's the safety distance that you can get away from your listing without giving you any kind of like manual penalty, I think it's also unlikely that outside probably 100 miles max that you're going to see substantive leads coming in through that listing. So My general guidelines and advice is going to be that depending on the niche, you're going to be want to be somewhere between 20 and 100 miles max.
Okay, awesome. And so you gave us your thoughts on reviews. You want to see 1 to 2 a week, ideally. What about responsiveness? What is that? How do we do that? How do we track our progress in that?
Yeah, responsiveness, I think, is probably the big leverage point in local service ads where you can make the biggest difference in the performance. And we'll talk about the bigger implication here in a few minutes. But what's interesting to me about local service ads is that unlike other platforms like Google Ads, traditional pay-per-click, there aren't buttons, levers, and pulleys to change up the variables to affect the results that you're getting. You have very little control. You can change your bid, you can change your targeting, and you can make sure that your entire listing is complete. But beyond that, everything else that you have to do really is an external behavior that can impact the listing or the performance of it. And so responsiveness, I think, is probably the one area where I see the most law firms struggle. And not just law firms, sorry, I kind of default to that because we work with a lot of law firms, but most businesses I see struggling with this responsive concept. So let me articulate a little bit of what we think it probably is based on Google guidelines, and then maybe some of the guidance that we've received talking to our internal reps at Google and our own experiences seeing calls come in. When we talk about phone calls specifically, responsiveness, oftentimes, at least the way we give guidance to our clients, is to make sure that you're answering your calls in under 30 seconds by a human being. And to further clarify what I mean by that, there are a lot of businesses out there who will have a tendency to use like an automated answering service, perhaps like either like a phone tree or an IVR or a recorded greeting. And then while that's going on in the background, they have a system that disseminating calls out to different individuals within the company. That is the one thing I've seen that will kill your local service ads performance more than any other thing. And we stumbled on this by accident. It was actually something that we've seen in observing not only the calls as we've looked at them inside of Google's dashboard that they supply everybody when they sign up for the program, but also as we started creating a custom dashboard that connects to the API of Google's LSA program, we were pulling in data and we started to see that Google is actually scoring each listing on some criteria that they use to determine whether you are responsive or not. And they call it internally, the name that they've given this metric is a phone lead responsiveness. And while we don't know every detail of what they're using to calculate that score, we do know they're keeping score. And we do know that score in and of itself has a lot to do with whether or not your listing is going to get leads. So the first best practice that you should be aware of is make sure a human being is answering calls in under 30 seconds. Next are message leads. Now, this is an option you can turn on or off. And so you don't have to have them, but there are ways, if you have this turned on, there are ways for a potential customer, client, or patient to contact you through Google using a messaging feature. The way this shows up on your end is it will come through as either an email notification, the little snippet of their messaging, or alternatively, if you have the local service ads app installed on a mobile device, it'll come through as a push notification that somebody has sent you a message. The general guidance that we've received from Google is to make sure that you're responding to message leads, ideally within 4 hours, and for sure no longer than 24. And this also is another thing we've seen that has really harmed performance on an account. Even just one message lead that's not replied to can have significant impact on whether the listing gets leads. Unlike PPC, LSA has one really cool feature in that you're not penalized when you turn it off and then turn it back on. So with both message leads and phone leads, in order to have the best responsiveness possible, what we recommend you do is, if there are times of the day in which you can't be certain that you're going to have great responsiveness, it's better to actually turn them off than it is to potentially end up with a lead where you get a missed call or slow responsiveness, or a message that you don't respond to until maybe the next morning. And that's something that you're going to have to weigh out the potential benefits. For example, you might say to yourself, yeah, but what if I get a lead during that time and I miss it because I didn't have it on? That, in theory, sounds great until you miss one, or you miss a phone call or something. And now your phone lead responsiveness has decreased. And now all those leads are just hypothetical, because now you're no longer getting them anymore, now that your phone lead responsiveness score has gone down. That would be my best advice, is try to follow the guidelines of answering in under 30 seconds, responding to messages in 4 hours or less, and for sure 24, and then turning off your ad altogether during hours in which you can't be certain that you can meet those standards.
I got a question for you, Corey.
Yeah.
Out of the 3 criteria, is there one that's more important for a business to try to approach first? Or like with reviews, for example, is it more important that they get more reviews, or that they're more responsive, or things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one segment of this video that we're going to talk about is penalties. What can happen if you don't meet some of these different standards? And while, again, just like everything else with Google, we don't have perfect clarity and understanding of how they implement some of these different penalties, we have received some guidance from them. One thing we know for sure is that the accounts are being evaluated on a 61-day rolling average. So some of these things, like say your reviews and your phone lead responsive score, are on that 61-day rolling average. And so if you end up with some low responsiveness, or you get a couple of bad reviews, it's going to take that 61-day period where you're going to be in a little bit of a sandbox. And then once you pop out of that, you actually return back to a neutral score in Google's eyes. So you don't return back to any previous highs. You just got to start building that over again. So in my estimation, knowing that criteria, I think your phone lead responsiveness is probably, of the two, the highest priority. However, having said that, it's 1A, 1B, because I really believe that they're both, those are the two crucial behaviors that make an LSA work. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if you have high responsiveness and good reviews, that will tend to overcome any other issue. I almost put them in a major minor category, where those two things are the majors, the others are the minors, and the minors only matter in so much as you have the majors dialed in. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, 100%.
So you keep talking about a phone responsiveness score, a 61-day penalty window. If I was a small business owner, how would I know that was happening to me?
Oh my gosh, this is one of the most frustrating parts. If I can be candid with you, the dashboard that you're supplied with when you sign up for local service ads is pretty lacking. It's not well organized, and it requires a lot of back and forth between different tabs in order to find what you need. And then on top of that, the phone lead responsive score that I've been referencing throughout this video is actually something you cannot see with the default dashboard that you get when you sign up for local service ads. There is a supplied API. And for those who aren't familiar, an API is simply a bridge that allows one software to talk to another software. When you use an API, all you're trying to do is get, say for example, another piece of software to pull information from the other one so that it can organize it in a way that is useful. In the case of Google's local service ads, we had to create a custom dashboard for our clients so that we could pull that data from the API and then organize it in a way where they could access everything all at once without having to click back and forth between all the different sections. And there's the additional information such as the phone lead responsive score that you can only see by having a custom built dashboard and then tapping into that local service ads API.
Okay, I've noticed you keep mentioning your rep with Google. Can you elaborate on that?
With local service ads, support has really been a bit of a sore spot for a lot of business owners because like pretty much every other Google product out there, they don't dedicate a lot of resources to it. And so it's gone through several iterations. At first, there was a phone number that you could call, but it was really oriented towards new signups. And that was about all they were prepared to help you with. And if you had technical questions, you'd be put into a queue. And oftentimes, throughout the first year of this product, I knew more when I would get on these support lines. I knew more about their own product than the people I was talking with. And they were just pretty much regurgitating from a manual. Then this last phase, Google moved away from anybody answering the phone. Now, the phone will be picked up immediately by someone if you're a new account that's looking to sign up. Or if you're looking for technical support, you can be looking at wait times as much as 30 to 60 minutes. And it will for sure be an overseas call center, and they will be working out of a manual. So it's oftentimes pretty frustrating for small business owners to get support on individual accounts. We discovered that there actually are two other tiers of support beyond that individual account support. And these other levels of support are reserved for Google Premier partners who have a lot of accounts under management and who really require a different level of support from somebody who can rapidly address issues. So in a way, being an agency is a pretty big advantage when it comes to local service ads because we have a dedicated rep who we can email or even message directly on a chat, tell her about an issue, and oftentimes as quickly as an hour and rarely more than 24 hours go by before she's able to look into and handle those issues. Those of us those who work with us to help manage these accounts, I think do gain a pretty big advantage through that support channel rather than having to rely on the individual account level support, which is severely lacking.
So it sounds as though Google kind of has an infrastructure in place to support agencies managing client accounts. What would you say the benefits of agency management are?
This has been a pretty hotly debated topic. And I'll admit that at the beginning of this, I played with local service ads to figure it out. And just oftentimes I was just doing it for free. I just asked clients like, hey, do you mind if I sign you up for this thing and just test it and try to figure it out? And at first, I really felt like I didn't know whether it made sense, whether there was enough value we could provide for it to make sense for us to offer a management service for local service ads. This is a pretty common sentiment. You still hear it a lot from a lot of agencies who say, it's not pay-per-click, you're not changing bids, you're not doing creative, there aren't landing pages to manage. And so what is it you're really doing and what's the value? To them, I would say, okay, you're right, it's not traditional PPC. However, let me use an analogy. This is where I think the real value of local service ads comes in. And if you can do this within your own company, then maybe you don't need an agency. And I think that's something that's debatable. Maybe not every business does. So the analogy is this. I mentioned earlier that a lot of these things that enhance the performance of your local service ads listing are external behaviors. where I see the best performance across all of our client accounts is when there is someone who is able to be like the leader of an orchestra, like a maestro, who is able to like coordinate and orchestrate all those different behaviors to ensure that they're continually operating the way they need to get peak performance out of the listing. That means paying attention on a regular basis to responsiveness and noticing when it drops and correcting it as quickly as possible. It means staying on top of your review velocity and ensuring that you're getting enough of them frequently enough. Finally, staying on top of and managing the settings in the listing. That isn't tremendously difficult, but it is just one more thing to do. Part of that responsibility is maintaining the individual leads themselves. And this is also a hotly contested thing. I don't want to get deep into the weeds on this particular video, but a lot of people do wonder, does it make sense to quote unquote work the dashboard? And that means like using Google's booking feature to like book the leads on a calendar or add detail to the listing and say, this is the person's name, this is their email, this is what they called about. The guidance we've received from Google is that doing those things don't affect account performance, quote, at this time. So what I interpret that to mean is that there isn't like a benefit in terms of, say, whatever algorithm runs the local service ads platform. But they haven't ruled it out. It clearly, just the fact that they told us at this time, I think clearly points to the fact that could be a change in the future. I've also seen some benefits from going in and adding details to the leads, such as disputing leads. This is another prime feature of using local service ads compared to pay-per-click. And that is that if it's not a lead that doesn't fit certain criteria, you can actually get a refund for it from Google. We've seen that the rate of approvals for those disputes goes up when somebody has gone in and added additional details to each of the leads to show why they're requesting a refund on that particular lead. So they might put in the commentary that they were asking for a service you don't provide. Excuse me. Starting to lose my voice. So working those leads in the actual dashboard may or may not convey a benefit at this time. It definitely helps with the dispute process. And Google may make an update in the future that where there is a bigger benefit in terms of whether or not they send you leads for having used their dashboard to some extent. So orchestrating all those things together, like I said, in this analogy, being the maestro, sometimes that's a bit of a burden on the business owner. And for not very much, we can handle that for you. And so I think it just comes down to really evaluating the numbers and determining, does it make more sense for us to have somebody who has access to the API, who has access to a dedicated support rep, and who already knows the platform inside and out to handle those maestro duties for you? Or for those few $100s a month, does it make more sense for us to do it internally and take away that attention from running the business?
All right, then what do you think the future holds for LSA?
Local service ads is a bit of an enigma. On the one hand, Google could do what they have done with other products and just pull the rug on it. We've seen them do it. They tried to jump into social media a while back, and that didn't work out well. I would argue, myself included, that they actually kept a lot of the old Google Plus, but they simply took it from being a separate social product and baked it into several different aspects of their technology, like their search engine, for example, and their phones. So I think to a degree, Google Plus didn't really disappear. It just morphed and hid itself in other products. Local service ads is one of those that could go either way because it's a huge departure from what they've done in the past with advertising. It's the first time Google has ever said, we will hand you a lead and you just pay us for that lead. In every other product, it's always been, you're merely paying for some type of visibility or a click, some action, but local service ads represents the first time where they've jumped into the lead gen game. I think that when you look, and I've talked about this before on some of our other videos, but I think when you look at the path Google's chosen over the past few years, there is some evidence that they are starting to at least toy with the idea of being the one who delivers the result to the end searcher, as opposed to merely being the bridge between the searcher and whoever gives them the result. So the very, very first iteration of Google ever was simply connecting a searcher with a link to a website that purported to contain the information they were looking for. And then over time, you've seen Google start to incorporate things into its actual search page where they're delivering the end result. You can see this with airline flights, weather, and a lot of times when you look at search results, you're oftentimes seeing the answer taken directly from someone else's website, displayed and presented right there in Google. So I think you can see a shift in Google's overall approach to being the deliverer of a result. And one could make the argument that local service ads is one more instance of them doing that, where they're saying, you know what, rather than simply taking you to a website where someone else is going to get that, be the one who gives you that lead, whether that be lead gen or whether that be the actual end business themselves, Google's sort of jumping in and saying, we're no longer going to just be merely the medium, we're going to be the one who actually gives you the result. So that might be, you know, there may be more of that, is I suppose what I'm trying to say. On the other hand, who knows? There's also some argument to be made that local service ads has somewhat impacted PPC revenues. And we all know that the vast majority of Google's revenue comes from its pay-per-click. So I think it's going to be an interesting year where it could go either way. But if I were a betting guy, I would probably lean towards it staying and evolving. So that's my best take on it. Let's touch on penalties a little bit more.
Okay.
I got a question about penalties then. Is there a criteria that is penalized more than the other for, like, if a bad review compared to not responding to a call or something? Does that make sense?
Are you asking if the penalty is different for one or the other?
Yeah. Is one penalty heavier than another penalty, or are they all like the same?
We don't know the exact answer to that, but we've seen some evidence that penalties for responsiveness can be more prolonged than penalties for reviews. For example, I think that based on the data that I've seen, I think it's somewhat based on the account itself and its past performance when it comes to evaluating reviews. And here's why. We have some law firms who it's a great effort to simply try to get one review a week. And that's because the cases can oftentimes be 6 to 12 months in length. And so it's not a electrical or HVAC where they're potentially servicing 50 accounts in a week. And so the threshold that they're trying to get beyond is that one a week, right? If they tend to drop down below that, then we can see pretty dramatic impact on the account performance. On the other hand, speaking of HVAC and electrical, because they have such high volume coming through, not only do they consistently see more reviews, but we've also seen where they'll get a 1-star review and see a very minimal impact on their call volume. Whereas we've seen on the opposite side of that, where there's very few reviews coming in, one negative review can impact their lead flow for weeks. So there's evidence there that each listing is being compared to itself and its past history. On the other hand, when we see low phone lead responsive scores, they oftentimes go into a prolonged period where you'll see there's like a graph inside the dashboard that kind of shows blips when you get a lead up and down on a graph. And you'll see that it'll go from very consistent to very inconsistent with big gaps in between the leads that are coming in. What that would lead me to believe is that concept of there being a 61-day rolling average applies more to the phone calls than it does to the reviews. And I think that the reviews are being more evaluated on the history of the account. What has it received lately? That's why I think that those HVAC accounts were impacted less by a negative review than, say, a law firm that gets very few reviews, right? It's going off of its own baseline.
That makes sense.
Okay, and then we've talked about how if I'm being penalized, I would have no idea. But are there any signs I could watch out for on my account to make sure that I'm not experiencing a dip like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I haven't really used this board much during this presentation, so this is a good opportunity for me to do. So when you log into your Google LSA dashboard, what it'll often look like is, so you have your dashboard like this. Off to the left-hand side, you're gonna have some little options over here. And I can't remember the exact order, but one of them is gonna say leads, and the other is gonna say reports. The difference between these two things is that this category looks at each of the individual leads. You can click into them really easily and take a look at the phone number, the time that it came in, and that's where you can add some details to the lead. The report is going to go into more of a financial cost per lead, things of that nature. Now, it also has down below here, it has the individual leads too. So to an extent, they are duplicate reports a little bit. Or maybe I should say they overlap a little bit. Okay. But you're going to see here, I think it's like total spend. And then the number of leads. And down here, you're going to have a cost per lead. As you're looking at this report, one of the ways that you can determine whether or not you've been put into the sandbox or you've been a victim of one of these penalties is right here in this section. You're going to see a graph that represents the number of leads you're getting over time. Okay, so it might be like 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, something like that, right? And then you have the dates across time. So you might see that you got 1, 2, 10, something like that, right? And during months where your listing has really high responsiveness and good reviews, this is going to look very consistent across time. Then what many business owners see is that all of a sudden they get this drop off that's very inconsistent. And sometimes they'll get 2 or 3 leads in a day, but then nothing continuing on. And this right here, where there's big gaps between days, or 1 lead and then nothing, and then 1 lead and nothing, that is a telltale sign of an account that has a phone lead responsive score that's been damaged, and that you're now in that 61-day evaluation period. So what you would want to do at that point, if this describes your account, is jump into rehabilitation mode, where you start implementing a lot of the different things that we recommend in order to try to prepare for when you get out of that evaluation period and Google allows you back on the stage and allows you to start getting more consistent leads again. You want to ensure that you don't repeat that process. Because we've seen it where a lot of accounts don't change their behavior and they just repeatedly come in and out of this cycle. Does that help answer your question? Oh, there's a little triangle there. I don't know how to get rid of him.
Okay, is there anything else you wanted to elaborate on?
So what I would leave you with is this. If you've seen inconsistency in your local service ads, it's likely that you've occasionally been put into one of these 61-day sandboxes where your listing's being reevaluated to determine whether Google wants to send you more leads in the future. If that's the case, I say contact us right away. There's no obligation. We're not going to hard sell you or pressure you or anything like that. We're here to help and be a resource. And if it makes sense for you to offload some of that responsibility to us, we're really affordable. And I think for many businesses, it makes a lot of sense to do that. But in the case that it doesn't, we'll just give you advice. We'll help you on your way. And we're always here as a resource for you to call us. Lastly, what I would tell you is that I think it's crucial if you are going to consistently pay for local service ads. I think it's essential that you know the score Google's keeping on your listing. That phone lead responsiveness is the key to everything. If you don't have that dialed in, you will not get consistent performance out of your local service ads. So at the very least, I think it makes a lot of sense. Reach out to us. Let's talk about the potential of building your very own local service ads dashboard. It's going to get rid of a lot of the headache that you have constantly having to go in and click around in the dashboard, try to find where's this, where's that. Everything is in one place, super easy to find. Plus, it gives you access to that data that you just don't get by logging into Google's own dashboard. You have to connect up to their API, and we know how to do that and make it available for you so that it's really easy for you to manage your own listing without hiring anybody like us. You can just do it as long as you have that number and you can keep tabs on it. I would say reach out to us. We're happy to chat. We're happy to talk to you about what your alternatives are, whether it's hiring us or just getting a dashboard and doing it on your own.
All right, awesome.
David, Savannah, thanks so much. I appreciate you guys and your questions, and hope this has been a really helpful and informative video for everybody.
Thanks, Corey.
Thank you, Corey.
So one topic people love to bring up all the time, and I think it's probably the most natural question to ask, is what's the recipe for success? How can they make their account successful? And I've always felt like this is a difficult question to answer sometimes, because I think they're often operating from in their mind, they're equating this to something like Google Ads. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're imagining some dashboard or framework where there's buttons and levers, things I can change on a regular basis to hone in on better performance.
Yeah.
And so that's a difficult thing to transition them into a different paradigm where, I don't know, to get better performance, you can't do that. It's almost like you have to do it from the outside in. So what types of things would you say to them are the keys to influencing from the outside in?
Are we talking like relationships? Or no, what am I thinking? Are we talking about like radius and reviews?
So radius comes up as it's almost like, I think they fall into two categories. There's what you can change, or there's technical issues that you can change with setting. And then there's things where you are being evaluated by Google, and the only way you can change them is through your behavior, the things you do through each call. Each call becomes cemented into your history, and you're being judged, and future performance depends on past performance.
Yeah.
So what are the types of behaviors and things that they can do going forward to try to influence that?
If we're talking behaviors within the company, then phone answering, I think, is the biggest one. You want someone, whenever your ads are live, whatever hours you set within your LSA, you want them answering calls within that time. And you want those calls answered in 30 seconds or less. If there's a missed call, if a call goes unanswered, it shouldn't happen. Ideally, that would never happen. Considering how it dings your phone responsiveness score, you should be opening the app, trying to call those callers back, try to recoup a little bit of the loss you incur from those missed calls. Other things they can do, I would say soliciting reviews is another one. That's something you can't really do from a management standpoint outside the firm.
Yeah.
It's something within the firm that they're going to have to push for.
This idea or this notion of being scored on your responsiveness, this is another one of those areas that I think is tough for people to get their head around. Because on the surface, I can tell a client, you're being judged. They're evaluating your responsiveness. And like the lens through which they see the world, they're going to see responsiveness as, well, why wouldn't we already be doing that? So they're going to, oftentimes, like the most common answer I hear is, yeah, we answer the phone all the time.
Yeah.
But we see on the other side of that, we see Google's evaluation of them. Mm-hmm. We see missed calls. We see low responsive scores. And it's oftentimes hard to get them to really understand that, like, you might have a standard for your own company. But if you want to get leads from LSA, your standard isn't relevant, Google's is. And so you can't change the nature of their standard. You're just going to have to figure out how to live up to it.
Yeah.
And for me, what I've observed so far is I think that the ideal situation would be that you have a dedicated line for LSAs separate from where all your other calls go. And that dedicated line gets routed to a live answer that is going to be picked up by a human being in 2 rings or less.
Yeah.
And that it will not ever be greeted by a recording, a phone tree, an IVR, any kind of automated, like you never want an LSA call to run into some kind of menu or anything other than a human being saying, hey, this is our law firm and how can we help? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think it's important for firms to consider that while their intake may be perfectly adequate for a normal day-to-day type thing, when it comes to Google, like you said, you're playing the game.
Yeah.
So you have to play their game by their rules and kind of out of your head about their own personal standards and feeling defensive of those. Because those missed calls that come in, sure, they could be spam. You still have to call them back.
Yeah. Now, there is a problem that we've noticed with Google. And seemingly, just based on the data, there are a certain amount of calls that seem to come in that are marked, but that we can't really track them down and find them in, say, a CRM or a call tracking system or whatever. They'll oftentimes just show up either in the Google dashboard under the new category and they'll say missed, or alternatively, sometimes we have access to more data on the back end of our systems, right? And a lot of times you'll just see a discrepancy or a gap between total calls and what Google calls connected calls.
Yeah.
And that gap oftentimes is just being counted as missed calls. And there's this score that they have that they call their phone lead responsiveness. And it seems like that gap, those number of missed calls, is probably being counted against your overall score.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to how it's a game that you're playing. Because I don't think any person would really call those missed calls that are never connected. You don't stand a chance. But you still have to play the game. You still have to call them back.
Yeah. It's interesting. For the longest time, I wondered why Google would tell us that your score goes up if you call back a missed call.
Yeah.
I spent weeks trying to figure out in my head, how in the world would Google know? And there's part of me that wears a tinfoil hat that thought, like, maybe they do. Maybe they actually know when I called somebody back somehow.
Yeah.
But then we were watching a YouTube video and somebody else was talking about using the app to call back missed calls, and it's like that was a big light bulb moment for me, realizing, oh, duh, if you use the app, and maybe that's their assumption, is that's just a natural inclination for every client or user to go download the app and utilize it on a day-to-day basis. My experience has been that probably only about less than 5% of users are using the app, but maybe they see something different on the retail side.
Yeah, you know what I would think is that when it comes to local service ads, it really seems like it was developed for other verticals. So something like maybe an independent handyman contractor or something, I could see them using their phone to help track and manage those leads. But for something like an injury law firm where managing their leads is the last of their worries, I can see why that's something that would go.
Yeah, I love that. Oftentimes the way I refer to that aspect of the platform is I'll tell people that you have engineers designing a product and they're going to have a particular paradigm that they look at when they're making that thing. And I think that it's not a coincidence that they started out with home services as their original niche.
Yeah.
And as a result, much of the language and categories and options within their dashboard are relevant specifically to home services. And so then when you go into a new service like law, you're looking at it going, nobody in an injury law firm has a booked appointment. That's not a thing.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it is part of Google's process and the naming conventions in their dashboard.
Yeah.
So I think that also somewhat relates back to this whole idea of just playing the game. You just got to figure out that, oh, perhaps that's one of the things they're measuring. So I realize we don't book appointments, but if we did, what would that look like?
Yeah, and I don't think it's unrealistic to say that some of those kind of leftover artifacts from it being rolled out for home services initially, that those won't be like corrected and fixed, because we've even seen from when we started, they were asking for background checks for lawyers, they were asking for proof of insurance, and those things have all disappeared from the dashboard. Now, I remember one was the lawyer license expiration date.
Yeah.
And that's gone now, which is good because it made no sense whatsoever. So they're definitely keeping an eye on it. They're definitely adapting it to the different niches and verticals. So I don't know, it's something that's always changing, I think.
So trying to be what they can do to be successful, make sure your settings in the beginning are all correct. And one of the most easily overlooked aspects of that, I think, is if you have more than one listing, having your targeting overlap.
Yeah. I know initially they didn't seem to be enforcing that, but I think we've seen as recently as, what was it, October?
Yeah.
Any overlap can cause severe penalties for both accounts. So
meaning you're going to drop in leads, phone calls.
Yeah, you're ranking everything.
Yeah.
They really don't want your boundaries overlapping, even if it's just a single neighborhood or zip code.
Now we have an unfair advantage in that regard because our Google rep will tell us, hey, I noticed.
Yeah, she'll notify us.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that connection, if you're not on that higher tier of LSA support, is there any way you can be notified of that, or are you just going to have to go manually?
I'm sure you could probably call support and they might be able to tell you, but it really comes down to just manually checking. It's zooming way in on that map, comparing between accounts. It's pretty tedious. It's pretty time consuming. And to adjust your targeting can be a real handful, considering it includes zip codes, cities, counties, everything.
Oh, so you could inadvertently overlap your targeting even though you tried not to.
Yeah.
So give me a scenario in which that might happen.
If you already had pre-existing targeting and like you're hearing this and you're thinking to yourself, oh no, I have overlapping targeting, I need to go get this corrected. Let's say you just delete every zip code from your LSA listing, and then you only put in the zip codes you want. If you didn't make sure you removed the cities and the counties as well, you could still have that overlapping targeting. You would have to remove absolutely everything before.
And then start clean.
Start clean.
Interesting. So technically, getting all your settings correct, your targeting, your so on and so forth. What about the completion of all your profile? There's pictures.
Yeah.
There's options about, do you have like free Wi-Fi parking?
Yeah. How many years in business? Like little badges almost you can add to the profile. Yeah.
Okay. So those show up as like a featured.
Yeah, like a little featured section to help you. I don't think it really helps with LSA rankings, but for the client-facing side, it's nice to see. It helps you stand out from your competitors.
So from a conversion standpoint. Okay. And then externally, reaching out on a regular basis to get good reviews. What happens if you get a bad one?
So they put you in a 60-day sandbox. Essentially, your account performance is just dinged for up to 60 days. Google really likes that. They really like having this huge time period of penalization, essentially. Like when it comes to your phone response score, that's calculated on a 90-day scale. So if you have a really bad responsiveness score, it could take you a full 90 days to get out of that. Likewise, with a 1-star review, it'll take 60 days for you to come back out of that penalty window. And in the meantime, the best thing you can do is solicit additional 5-star reviews. When you see a 1-star review come through, that's really when you should be putting the pedal to the metal and trying to get those 5-star reviews at all costs.
Finally, let's talk about responsiveness. So answering the phone, ideally under 2 rings by a person, never having any kind of automation or voicemail or anything like that. What would you say to somebody who's had issues with that in the past, but they want to improve upon it going forward? What are things they could do?
It depends on, I would say, their phone response score, where they're sitting. If someone's at a 0.05 phone response score, it's probably best to just scrap it and start over. But if you're somewhere around like a 0.3 or 0.4, I think that's something that can be rehabilitated. The difficult thing is you wouldn't know what that phone response score is unless you're pulling from the API. And so that requires getting kind of software developers to go in, figure out how to pull that data, present it to you in a readable format. But if someone is in that 0.3, 0.4 range where their score could be rehabilitated, like we said, the phone needs to be answered in 30 seconds or less by a human being. You want to make sure every single missed call you receive is called back. If you have message leads toggled on, the sooner you can respond to them, the better, but it has to be in 24 hours or less.
Cool. I think that pretty much covers all the things you would do to get the most out of your LSA.
Yeah.
I would say that there are some other things that are speculative and somewhat unproven. I know that and maybe we'll make a whole video out of this particular topic, like rumors and myths, but these are the things that I think are confirmed. We've seen it. We've had Google confirm it for us.
Yep.
And we've seen other agencies and other parties confirm these things.
Yep.
So I think they're pretty tried and tested.